So Venom's gonna become God over the course of this video, and it's gonna be amazing. He's gold and everything. It's so dope. So we are here at the end of Venom War, basically the answer to what happens when Marvel decides to take a 6-issue story arc and stretch it out over the course of several months and turn it into a wholly convoluted, disorganized mess. So what this story does is this initially opens up with Eddie Brock after having been stabbed through the chest. Now, I will catch you guys up and kind of make sense of everything that's happening here. I'm not going to require you to go back and watch the playlist if you want to understand it. It is there if you're going to want a more comprehensive explanation of what we'll talk about here. But in effect, in the last video, and what had kind of been building up to this point, is that yes, Meridius is a future version of Eddie, right? The person that Eddie will become if he continues to hold on to the Venom symbiote and stayed the King in Black in the aftermath of his defeat of Null, the symbiote god. We'll make more sense out of that whole thing with Meridius here in a little bit. But even Meridius himself wasn't necessarily sure that he was going to win. And so in order to solidify his victory against Eddie, he allied himself with Carnage, because Carnage is kind of a rogue symbiote that exists out there, that technically speaking, Eddie Brock as the King in Black can control all traditional symbiotes. But when Carnage bonded itself to Cletus Cassidy, it just sort of like broke away from the symbiote hive mind, which is why Carnage has always kind of felt like an island unto himself when it came to all the other symbiotes that are out there, because he kind of is. But Meridius allying with Carnage also meant that he was able to build on all the power that Carnage had acquired as he was traveling through the multiverse, killing every version of Venom he could possibly find, acquiring power of his own so that he could kill Eddie and try to become the new King in Black, right? So effectively, Meridius and Carnage had the same goal. They were just going about it in different ways. And so when Meridius made the deal with Carnage, he ends up taking the all-blood spear that Carnage had, kind of Carnage's own version of the all-black necro sword from Gore the God Butcher and all the symbiote god, you know, whoever you think is most famous for possessing it. But this is why Meridius is here in this moment, because Meridius arriving here is the second part of a two-pronged attack. The first prong was basically seizing the spear of Carnage in the first place, which allowed Carnage to quote-unquote infect Meridius. And because Meridius is a future version of Eddie, that Meridius could in turn basically infect the younger version of himself. That's why Eddie was stabbed, because he was turning into Carnage. And because Eddie was turning into Carnage, every symbiote across the world and the universe that Eddie controlled was turning into Carnage as well. So of course, Eddie's son basically had to stab him in order to get the symbiote off of him and to get Eddie back to himself. But Eddie's literally dying here, right? Like he's just bleeding out. So there really isn't a whole lot that anybody can do. And so Meridius showing up is to basically wipe out all that remains of these other symbiotes who were there. It's kind of Al Ewing just sort of mopping up and cleaning up everything he's done up to this point. So in essence, Toxin, right, one of the symbiote offspring that's out there, he's basically taken out. It doesn't really seem like he's destroyed. It just seems like he's incapacitated. It goes on and on and on and on. But that's when you pick up with the son of Eddie from the future. And that's where things got a little murky in the events of Venom War. We didn't quite know what his story was. He was almost this version of like Cable from the X-Men before the Venom mythos, in the sense that in the middle of Venom War, right, like Dylan Brock from the future just shows up to the present day and tells his younger self, hey man, I'm on a mission, just chill. A time's gonna come when you're going to have to do something that you think is extreme, i.e. attacking your dad. Do not have any doubts, go through with it, is more or less what he said. But Dylan from the future was on this quest where he came across Chthon, he dealt with Loki, he ended up going after Molten Man and all that kind of stuff, but we didn't know what it was all for. We knew that like Loki had fashioned 2 bullets for him using the Molten Man's, you know, kind of liquid coating and that sort of thing, but like that was really it. This is what it all came down to, that while Dylan Brock was trying to avoid a future, and in this comic he'll explain how that future comes to fruition, that he literally fires off one of these bullets into Dylan. And what it does is it allows the basically skin or the liquid form of Molten Man to merge with Dylan. And it's actually put incredibly well. On the surface, it doesn't really seem like it, but when you kind of look at everything that's happened and take the context into account, it does, right? It says the gold resists the red. And more than that, we can feel it on the deep levels of our being. It burns the red out. Eggenrack, the anti-Carnage. Of course, it's Carnage spelled backwards, but the cool thing about this, and this is why the whole story arc with future Dylan matters, because remember, one of the things that goes on here, and one of the things to keep in mind with Marvel in general, is that Carnage is a godly level character now, right? And that's one of the reasons why the Venom run by Al Ewing going into Venom War was really confusing for a lot of people, because there were a lot of moving parts, right? Kind of bringing in these plot threads and sort of wrapping these plot threads up in a way that the story doesn't necessarily do that well. That when it came to Carnage, for years and years and years, you guys just knew him as Carnage. That was it, right? Carnage was just a guy. But there was a story that we covered where the Carnage symbiote was separated from Cletus Cassidy, its traditional Carnage host. But in the aftermath of Eddie Brock destroying Null the symbiote god, taking the role of the King in Black, and then attaining this whole new level of power, whether it was jealousy or Carnage's eyes being open to the fact this level of power existed, where he didn't really understand it when Null had initially shown up, that Carnage went on a quest across the multiverse to kill every Venom he could find, and then basically nullify all the weaknesses that symbiotes traditionally have. And he did that, right? He literally took out guys like Malekith the Accursed and so on and so forth. But by the time you got to the start of Venom War, Carnage was immune to like sonics and fire and all the things that symbiotes are traditionally immune to, right? Hence the idea of him kind of being an island unto himself. And so while there is technically ways to destroy the King in Black, there really didn't seem to be a way to destroy Carnage. So even if the King in Black was defeated, Carnage would still attain his godhood, and Carnage would still be a massive threat to the Marvel Universe, potentially outclassing most every single superhero that was out there. Now, we will find out in the story that Carnage had actually bet big and had bet wrong, and that Carnage ended up screwing up in the worst way when he did this whole thing. But the fact is that when Dylan from the future started traveling around on his quest, that there was Molten Man, who essentially has a kind of metallic skin, but it's liquid in nature, the same way a symbiote is. That in turn, that liquid was taken to like Chthon, who basically enchanted it at the request of Dylan Brock. That in turn was taken to Loki, who blessed it with Asgardian magics, and then turned it into bullets. So what you're looking at right here, and this is one of the reasons why I say that this is Venom as God, but in a way that Marvel just completely squanders, is that with this new level of power that he attains, he literally just starts giving Meridius the business. Now, this is why godhood is so interesting here, but such a weird thing. Meridius is a future version of Eddie. Meridius is what Eddie will become. Meridius, when he initially appeared, he could travel back and forth through time at will. He controlled all symbiotes in existence to the point that in the far-flung future, he had pulled all the symbiotes in the universe out of the main universe itself and then put them in a pocket dimension called the Garden. He created a whole new dimension within the Marvel Universe that just never existed before. This guy was nigh unstoppable, right? He was every bit as powerful, if not more powerful, than Null the symbiote god. Now, we never really saw displays of their power in the same way, and we certainly never saw them fight each other. So in reality, like most power scaling, Null versus Meridius would just come down to us cooking the books and then choosing the conclusion that we want the most. But the thing that goes on here is that when you have this version of Venom crushing a guy as powerful as Meridius that has all these abilities at his disposal, it's a whole new level of power, because in essence, this version of Venom can probably do everything Meridius can do and more. What would you call the guy who is powerful enough to kill God? You would call him the new God, right? And so it's really interesting when this goes down, because again, Marvel kind of squanders this. Now, it also gets intriguing because Meridius literally tries to take his own symbiote matter and encase Dylan, right, who has basically been shot by this bullet and given this new level of power, and it doesn't work. Now, Eddie does kind of try to step in as best he can, but not even Eddie can really do anything. And that's where you realize Eddie is a distraction, because while Eddie Brock in the present looks at Meridius and sees Meridius as himself for the future, the mannerisms are very similar. Meridius really reminds Eddie Brock of himself when he first got the Venom symbiote, drunk on power, believing himself to be this nigh unstoppable force that exists out there. And so when you're that drunk on your own power, when you buy that much into your own hype, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to be careless, and someone is going to take that opening and tear down everything you've built. And that's exactly what Dylan does, because Dylan looks down at the spear and realizes if the nature of his power is to basically cure or to eliminate the very nature and essence of the Carnage symbiote itself, in the same way that anti-venom wipes away illness, disease, different things like that, then he could take that spear, and he literally does. He seizes that spear for himself. And so now he has at his disposal, in his hand, all the power that Carnage had at the beginning of Venom War, right? All that godly power that Carnage has seized, now it belongs to Dylan, and Dylan uses it to cleanse the spear and then in turn stab Meridius through the chest. And that kills Meridius on the spot. It wipes him out. And that's what we're literally told here, right? I feel Meridius' dying scream at the edge of our connection as he echoes through his own, touching all that he touched. His special monsters, his symbiote Frankensteins, his zombiotes, right? The zombie symbiotes are running around Marvel, a story that was squandered almost as fast as it was created. The mindless unlife they had dies with him, and they fall all across the city, all across the world, right back to the source. Every symbiote bonded to a human ceases to function, melting into inert symbiote matter. Every single one. Of course, the implication being here, every one but Lee Price. Why? Well, I don't know, because Marvel doesn't want to kill him off. The plot demands it. Who knows? Technically, he should be done and gone, right? For those of you guys who don't know who Lee Price is, Lee Price was Marvel's attempt to kind of introduce a new alternative to Eddie Brock and to kind of give him his own story, right? What would happen if, like, not really a traditional villain, but basically a guy who was just a dick got the Venom symbiote, right? Like, that was Lee Price. Now, I liked Lee. I thought Lee Price was kind of cool, but there were a lot of people who didn't like him, especially when it came to like Eddie Brock purists, right? People who didn't want anybody but Eddie to ever be Venom, which would ultimately lead to a whole bunch of boring stories later on down the line. But what makes this cool is that with Meridius dead and gone, now the idea of Eddie Brock having to become Meridius in the future, while technically that will take place, what this means now is that Eddie Brock's existence is circular, or at least that seems to be the case, because what we're told here is that with Eddie Brock having been stabbed, with Meridius having been defeated, Eddie Brock's role as the King in Black is cut off. That power is gone from him forever. And so it's really just kind of Marvel telling us that if Eddie Brock ever happens to gain the symbiote again, he'll just be a dude with the symbiote, like you would normally expect with the character of Eddie. Don't necessarily know how I feel about that. I loved the idea of Eddie as the King in Black, and I feel like just not enough was done with it long enough for us to know what could actually happen. Because, I mean, to kind of give you guys the fast track, right, of Eddie's time as the King in Black, it happened just like this. Eddie defeats Null, Eddie becomes a new King in Black. Eddie dies. Eddie goes to the garden. He ends up encountering Meridius. He realizes he doesn't want to be Meridius, and Meridius is trying to kill his son. So everything that's happened over the course of really the beginning of Al Ewing's run on Venom in the aftermath of the King in Black story with Null, up until now, was just Eddie Brock trying to stop Meridius from killing his son. And then ultimately Eddie Brock attaining a new level of power, right, where he could resurrect himself from anything. And now Eddie Brock can't be the King in Black anymore. This guy became King in Black. He had one adventure and lost it. It's kind of disappointing when you look at it for what it is, right? I mean, you know, we're glossing over a few things, but still, that's the long and short of it. And so what you end up getting is Dylan talking to his future self. Because what happens is there's a kind of conversation there. Dylan in the present still doesn't fully know what's going on. Even with this new level of power that he has as this like golden symbiote and the son of Eddie, he still doesn't fully grasp everything. So he's like, you know, I guess I should thank you, future me, for what you did. And his future version's like, what are you talking about? Like, you really don't get it, do you? And he's like, the big bad who made my future happen, where symbiotes basically took over everything, wiped out pretty much all the superheroes, and basically I'm effectively dying, right? Like the person who was the big domino that started the whole topple of the world in the first place. I told you what you wanted to hear, what you expected to hear, that Eddie Brock had started it. It all started when I beat Meridius tonight, when I took Venom back. But now that won't happen. I fixed it, I can rest. I'm sorry, kid, but that bullet had your name on it. And so that was the whole idea behind it, right? Dylan, when he initially came back and talked to his younger self, he's like, yeah, man, that's why you're probably going to have to stab your dad, right? That kind of thing. But it was all a lie. It was all basically him saying, actually, we're the bad guys. But the reality here is that if he had told Dylan, there's going to come a point when you are going to kill Meridius. And when that happens, you're going to take the symbiote back from him, and then you're going to become corrupted by it. And in your corruption, you're going to wipe out every single superhero in the world. You're going to destroy the world as we know it, lay waste to everything. Then Dylan would have done nothing at all. He wouldn't have been here. And then likely Meridius would have ended up winning. And then whatever Meridius wanted to do is what the future would have become. So the best thing for Dylan from the future to do was to lie to his younger self, right? Just kind of create this circumstance where he would be momentarily distracted enough that Dylan could effectively secure the victory, not just here, but for the future as well. So future Dylan ends up going back to his time. Now that's where things get a little murky, run into paradoxes, and so most likely Dylan's future is now an alternate reality, in the same way that things like Days of Future Past are alternate realities in Marvel Comics instead of like the guaranteed future, because that guaranteed future was prevented. And so what ends up happening is that whether Dylan intends it to be the case or not, that the Venom symbiote itself casts Dylan out. And the Venom symbiote is kind of wrestling with this new level of power that it has. And it's kind of trying to reconcile these two sources of power. Now, of course, cops come busting in, they spray the place down with anti-symbiote bullets, and Venom looks like he's dead, but he actually just kind of like takes off, right, and just sort of disappears, and that's it. But what this does, and there is a little kind of a epilogue here, which is immensely cool. What this does is, in effect, it sets the stage for the new, all-new Venom comic that's going to be coming out, where like there's going to be a new host for Venom. Now, as most of you guys know, the movies don't really copy the comics anymore. Instead, the comics copy the movies. Because the comics aren't maintaining Eddie Brock as Venom just because of the Sony films, it's anybody's guess who the new host is going to be. And I imagine Marvel may not even know, right? I mean, they're probably figuring it out, right? You know, but still, like, Eddie Brock is no longer Venom in the movies, so there's no reason for Eddie Brock to stay Venom in the comics. I know it sucks, but that's kind of how Marvel does things now. And so what you do is you switch over to the church where Eddie Brock originally became Venom in the first place. Because in reality, he just doesn't quite know where to go. Because he's just a normal human, because he doesn't really have any powers anymore or anything like that, that he actually encounters Carnage. But Carnage doesn't kill him. Instead, what Carnage does is he reveals what had actually gone on. Carnage had put so much of his power in the spear that when the spear was given to Meridius and then taken by anti-Carnage Dylan Brock and cleansed, that Carnage no longer has access to all that power that he had before, meaning Carnage is back to his normal self, just good old regular Carnage. But here's one of the only cool things to come out of the ending of this story. What Carnage does is he says, let's make a deal, Eddie, right? Like, I'm dying because I don't have a host. These days, I need one in order to survive. You're dying because you don't have a symbiote that can heal you. So let's merge. I'll let you be in control. And I will say this, I am really excited to see what happens with Eddie Brock becoming Carnage. Fingers crossed Marvel doesn't like ruin it and turn Eddie Brock into just like a villain of the week as Carnage. Who knows, right? I guess it really depends on who it is that's going to be writing the new story. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comments section. Feel free to post questions if you have them, and I will answer them as best I can. If you want to see all this in its totality, make sure you click this link to the playlist. It covers the entire Venom run from Al Ewing, starting at the very beginning, running all the way up until the end of Venom War. And yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.